There has been a nuclear accident in the Soviet Union.
What's happening tonight, the Soviets are saying little, but what is known is cause for concern. A nuclear accident has occurred at a Soviet atomic plant in the Ukraine.
It's now clear that the Soviet Union has suffered one of the worst disasters in the history of nuclear power.
The United States and the Soviet Union fought as allies during World War II, but soon after World War II ended, the relationship began to deteriorate. The Soviet Union and the United States were making massive nuclear advances in the 1970s and 80s. In the late 80s, the Cold War was in full throttle. There was lots of conflict and nuclear tension between the USSR and the US. It led to many large conflicts, including the Cuban Missile Crisis. The blockade of Cuba occurred from October 16, 1962 to October 29, 1962. The U.S. discovered that Soviets were actively moving nuclear weapons into Cuba. The U.S. imposed a naval blockade on Cuba and would stay there until the Soviets agreed to remove their nuclear warheads. It brought the world close to nuclear conflict and is yet another example of these two world powers clashing heads. Construction for the Chernobyl plant began in Pripyat, Soviet Union, due to the large need for power in the Soviet Union. The plant provided over 25% of the Union's power. It was crucial to the Soviet Union's job economy, creating over 800,000 new jobs, and at one point having a workforce of over 60,000 plus workers daily. Communism sparked many revolutions and the creation of new countries all over the world. There were many communist countries during the Cold War period. This included North Korea, Germany, and Poland. It could be said that communism had a great influence on the events leading up to the Chernobyl disaster. Communism in the Soviet Union had allowed the Soviets to create secrecy and lies in their government, due to the Soviet officials putting themselves over other important ideas and issues, greater proving the influence communism had on Soviet Russia. High-level officials that ran the Chernobyl plant, like Anatoly Dyatlov, were more worried about impressing other Soviet officials than the well-being and safety of the power plant and those who worked there. On the other hand, Leonid Topchinov was a young engineer deemed a hero for his efforts to stop the disaster from occurring. He later died from radiation exposure from the disaster. He was only 25 years old. On the day of the explosion, Chernobyl's reactor 4 had been showing abnormal signs. Despite young engineer Leonid Topchinov's warning and his training suggests they shut the reactor down, Dyatlov threatened him and pushed him to continue with the experiment they were conducting. Soviet officials neglected safety measures, overworked employees with 12-plus-hour shifts, and failed to provide proper living conditions. These harsh conditions violated the rights of workers and led to the fatigue of the workers. All these factors played a direct role in the disastrous event of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant explosion. On April 26, 1986, when Anatoly Dyatlov, in charge of a reactor test, ignored critical safety warnings, young engineer Leonid Topchinov on the midnight shift mistakenly allowed the reactor's power to increase too high. Despite protocols advising shutdown, Dyatlov insisted the test continue, pushing Topchinov to raise the power. This made the reactor dangerously unstable. When Topchinov tried to initiate an emergency shutdown, a power surge triggered a series of explosions. At 1:23 a.m. on April 26, Reactor 4 exploded, releasing massive radiation spreading for miles and causing one of the worst nuclear disasters in history. The Soviet Union attempted to conceal the news of the Chernobyl disaster. Even in Pripyat, which was just a few miles away, news of the disaster was downplayed massively. Their cover-up was foiled when a Swiss radiation monitoring station detected high levels of wind-transported radiation. The Swiss were able to link the cause to the USSR. The overwhelming national pressure forced the Soviets to announce that there had been a quote-unquote accident at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. As we know, the damage of the disaster is far greater than what the Soviets said it to be. The initial explosion only killed 2 people, but instantaneously, the explosion released between 50 and 185 million radioactive particles into the atmosphere, engulfing Europe in radiation. Evacuation efforts in the surrounding town of Pripyat were only started 36 hours after the initial explosion, due to the Soviets stalling with an attempt to cover up the disaster. This attempt was foiled, meaning 50,000 plus people had to be evacuated in just days. Days later, an exclusion zone was established. This zone deemed 1,600 square miles of land around the Chernobyl plant uninhabitable. In today's world, this zone reaches parts of Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. The Chernobyl disaster represents the severity of nuclear accidents and their profound impact on the environment. Over time, the radiation caused animal mutations with wildlife. This wildlife suffered from deformities and genetic changes. Additionally, children exposed to radiation developed thyroid cancer and other health issues, highlighting the devastating consequences of nuclear disasters. It set the stage for several thousand radiation-induced illnesses and cancer deaths over the years. The cleanup of the Chernobyl disaster remains an ongoing effort, costing over $68 billion so far. In an attempt to contain the radiation, a concrete sarcophagus was constructed around Reactor 4, but the progress was not without incident. On October 2, 1986, a helicopter crashed into a crane and fell into the reactor while workers were filling it with sand. When completed, the sarcophagus trapped over 240 tons of radioactive material, but over time it began to deteriorate. To prevent further radiation leaks, a safe confinement dome was built over Reactor 4 between 2010 and 2016. The full cleanup of the Chernobyl plant is expected to be completed by 2065. The disaster was one of the many events that occurred showing the weakness of communism in the Soviet Union, ultimately leading to its collapse in 1991. Its predecessor, Russia, was founded days later. The Chernobyl disaster marked a major breaking point in history. The rights of many were violated, and the Soviet Union evolved this situation into something unimaginable. The Soviets did not uphold the responsibility they had to the world. They allowed this disaster to spiral out of control into something never seen before, affecting many and leaving a lasting effect on the world and its environment.